When 4-year-old Edward Johnson first tugged at his mother Mary's sleeve, she was distracted, thinking about the grocery list, not hidden distress. Edward was a beautiful, quiet child, a boy who preferred communicating with soft gestures over words, a habit that had worried his father, Benjamin, lately. Their afternoon walk had taken an accidental detour down a desolate service alley next to a condemned warehouse, a labyrinth of rust and concrete. "Mommy, Doggy is sad," he murmured, his voice so soft it was swallowed by the ambient city hum. Mary glanced at the derelict, graffiti-scarred structure. "It's just the sound bouncing off the walls, sweetie. It's not safe here. We need to go home." She tried to pull him away, but Edward's small hand slipped free. His gaze was fixed on a section of the main wall that looked suspiciously patched, the cement newer than the grime surrounding it. Mary had never seen such fierce, unyielding conviction in her son. Edward rarely engaged with the world, yet now he was drawn to this cold, ugly structure with a focus that chilled her. "Edward, come back here now," she commanded, her tone laced with anxiety about the location. The warehouse was scheduled for demolition. But the boy ignored her. He pressed his ear against the cold, rough surface. "It's hurt," Edward whispered, pressing both small, brown palms against the wall. They trapped him. Something in his clarity, his utter certainty, broke through Mary's skepticism. Edward didn't invent drama, he avoided it. She knelt down, her heart thudding, and placed her own ear to the concrete. Through the dense barrier, beneath the sound of her own pulse, she heard it, a faint, desperate whimper, rhythmic and unmistakable. Someone, or something, was alive, and suffering, entombed behind the wall. This wasn't imagination. This was a nightmare. Mary's heart seized the moment she confirmed the sound. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a pipe, and it wasn't the creak of the old warehouse settling, it was the soft, desperate, rhythmic inhale and exhale of a living creature in extreme distress, sealed away from the world. She snatched up her phone, her fingers fumbling with the numbers for emergency services, her mind racing through the horrific possibilities. Who would do this? The dispatcher sounded skeptical, her tone shifting to professional caution when Mary, tears finally welling, repeated the impossible request, "There's a dog," cemented into the wall of a building scheduled for demolition. Mary stepped back, pulling Edward close to her hip, shielding him from the crumbling, dangerous facade, but Edward kept craning his neck, staring at that small, patched square of concrete. He didn't cry or scream. His silence was heavy, burdened by the suffering he felt radiating through the wall. When the first response vehicle finally arrived, it wasn't the fire department but a specialized municipal crew, followed by a local police cruiser. The crew chief, a man named Wilfred with eyes that conveyed exhaustion and disbelief, stepped out. "Ma'am, we get calls like this. Usually, it's a pipe or a prank. That wall's load-bearing, we can't just." "Listen," Mary cut him off, urgency sharpening her voice, pushing past politeness. She forced him closer to the wall, right where Edward was still standing. Edward, usually afraid of strangers, stepped aside only for Wilfred, pointing to the patch. Wilfred, annoyed, leaned in, and his expression shifted instantly. The skepticism vanished, replaced by a deep furrow of alarm. The muffled whimpering was real. It was agonizing. But still, Wilfred shook his head. "We need heavy equipment and a demolition permit, ma'am. It's too risky. We could collapse the whole side of the building." Mary started to plead, her voice rising in a desperate pitch, when a tall man with a worn rescue helmet stepped forward from the crew. This was Richard. He dropped his heavy tool bag. He hadn't said a word, but he'd been watching Edward. Edward, who now looked up at Richard with those large, pleading eyes, his small face contorted with silent, profound pain. Richard, later revealed to be an animal welfare activist operating undercover, met the boy's gaze. It wasn't Mary's hysteria that moved him, it was the absolute, heartbreaking conviction in the child's stance. "Give me a sledgehammer," Richard announced, his voice carrying an unexpected authority. He ignored Wilfred's immediate protestations about liability. "That sound is a cry for help. If we wait for a permit, we'll be digging out a carcass." He gave Edward a quick nod. "We start now, slow and easy." The sound of the first jarring blow against the concrete was shocking, a loud crack that echoed through the alley. Edward flinched but didn't look away, holding Mary's hand so tight her knuckles were white. The agonizing, grinding process of demolition, slow, cautious, inch by terrible inch, had begun. Did Richard make the right call to ignore protocol and start the demolition? Do you think the dog will survive? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe as we continue to see what happens to Edward and Ghost. The heavy thud of the sledgehammer echoed in the desolate alley, a terrifying sound to Mary, who gripped Edward's hand, pulling him back from the immediate danger zone. The first crack in the patched concrete was a victory, but it felt agonizingly small against the vastness of the wall and the unknown timeframe of the rescue. The crew chief, Wilfred, muttered darkly about the paperwork, but Richard, the rescue technician with the quiet intensity, ignored him, focusing his powerful blows with steady, controlled force, chipping away small, manageable chunks. Every successful piece of masonry that fell gave Mary a surge of hope, followed instantly by a fresh wave of panic for the animal sealed inside. As the chipping continued, the whimper grew slightly louder, confirming the precise location and, horrifyingly, the desperate condition of the creature. It wasn't a bark or a growl, it was a sound of absolute, quiet defeat. Edward watched the process with total focus. He was the only one who seemed completely calm, his worry transmuted into resolute patience. He didn't ask questions, he simply stood as the silent advocate for the being in distress. After nearly 20 minutes of grueling labor, Richard paused, wiping sweat from his brow. The hole was still too small, but he jammed the light from his phone into the deepening fracture. The faint beam disappeared into the darkness. John, the officer from the cruiser, moved closer, radioing for a camera scope, his skepticism finally dissolved by the sheer effort and the ongoing, heartbreaking sound. Richard pulled back a final, thick piece of cement, creating a viewport. He knelt, shining his light into the cavity, and what he saw stole the air from everyone's lungs. Mary gasped, clamping her hand over her mouth. Sealed into the concrete, in an upright, unnatural position, was the emaciated form of a German shepherd. The dog, later known as Ghost, was fully grown, its massive frame confined by the rock-hard plaster that held it in a permanent, agonizing stand. Its eyes were barely open, glazed over with dehydration and pain, but it was alive. And as the light hit its face, the whimpering stopped. It was replaced by the shallow, struggling gasps of a creature too weak to even cry. They were looking at an animal that had been cemented alive, left for dead. The slow, agonizing demolition had only just begun. The horror is only just beginning. We want to hear from you. What do you think motivated someone to commit such a cruel act? Share your theories in the comments below. And let us know where in the world you're watching this unbelievable story unfold. The sight of Ghost, cemented into the wall like a terrible sculpture, paralyzed the crew. Wilfred was sputtering about professional conduct and the police were preparing to call for specialized demolition experts, a process that would take hours and seal the dog's fate. Mary felt the silence descend, broken only by Ghost's ragged breathing. She was about to erupt in a desperate plea when she looked down at Edward. The 4-year-old had not cried during the initial terrifying discovery, but now, watching the dog struggle to breathe in the small shaft of light, Edward's face crumpled. Silent tears streamed down his cheeks, and he took a shaky step forward. He reached his hand toward the viewport, his small, dark fingers just brushing the jagged edge of the broken concrete. "Water," Edward suddenly articulated, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the standoff between the professionals. The word was commanding, completely unlike his usual soft murmur. "Doggy needs water." The clarity and authority in the child's voice stunned everyone. It was Richard, the quiet technician, who reacted first. He saw the sheer, telepathic connection, the boy instinctively understanding the dog's most immediate need. Richard knew, as an experienced operative dealing with animal cruelty cases, that every minute counted. Legalities could wait, survival couldn't. "The boy is right," Richard stated, his eyes fixed on Edward. He looked directly at Wilfred, pulling rank that wasn't officially his. "We stop chipping and we start excavating. Slowly. This dog is dying of dehydration, not impact. We need a small opening near its head, now." He grabbed a chisel and a smaller, more precise hammer, ignoring the escalating protest from Wilfred. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a desperate race against the clock, fueled by the sheer force of a small boy's empathy. The work that followed was agonizing. Richard worked with surgical precision, trying to free the dog's head from the concrete bondage. Edward, now silent again, stood closer than Mary dared to let him, holding his mother's sleeve with one hand and using the other to silently urge Richard on. When Richard finally managed to chip away enough material to free Ghost's muzzle and neck, he carefully fed a tiny amount of water from a bottle cap to the dog. Ghost took the water greedily, and the quiet, terrible struggle for air eased slightly. They had bought Ghost a few precious minutes, but the rest of the body remained locked in the stone prison. The slow, perilous demolition had transitioned into a life-saving, careful excavation. The dog is finally able to drink, but time is running out to free him entirely. Richard is risking his job for this rescue. Do you think the dog's life is worth the sacrifice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and where are you watching from as this incredible act of bravery unfolds? His small victory of getting water to Ghost was immediately overshadowed by the gargantuan task remaining, freeing the massive German Shepherd from the rest of its concrete tomb. Richard worked with exhausting focus, chiseling away the hardened material around the dog's chest and legs. The air was thick with the dust of the old cement, mixing with the metallic tang of fear and urgency. Mary held a damp cloth over Edward's face, pulling him slightly further back, but the boy resisted, his eyes never leaving the struggling animal. He seemed to know, instinctively, that his presence was a lifeline for the dog. As Richard chipped and pried, he started to discover the horrifying truth of Ghost's entrapment. The dog hadn't just been buried, it had been meticulously sealed. The cement around its limbs wasn't haphazard, it was like a perfectly cast mold, suggesting a deliberate, professional attempt to silence and immobilize the animal permanently. Ghost was emaciated, its ribs visible even through the layer of dust and grime, confirming it had been suffering for days. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard struck a clean break near the dog's hip. With a final, agonizing heave, he managed to pry free a large section of the remaining wall. Ghost's heavy body slumped slightly, finally free from the upright torture, but still half encased. The crew had to move as one, supporting the dog's weight while Richard worked to free the final pieces. The relief was palpable when Ghost's last paw was freed, leaving a perfect, ghostly impression of the German Shepherd in the jagged concrete shell. Ghost was immediately wrapped in a blanket, his breathing shallow and rapid. As the dog lay weak but free on the ground, the first thing it did was turn its massive head, its amber eyes locking onto the small, dark figure of Edward Johnson. There was no growl, no fear, just a look of profound, exhausted recognition. Edward, for his part, broke free from Mary's grasp and knelt beside the dog. He didn't pet him aggressively, but simply placed one hand gently on Ghost's flank, right above its heart. A hush fell over the professionals as the boy and the dog shared a moment of absolute, silent communion, two souls recognizing a profound, shared understanding. The bond is already undeniable. If you believe this incredible connection between a little boy and a dog is proof that hope can survive the darkest cruelty, make sure you subscribe and share this story. Ghost was rushed to the emergency veterinary clinic, carried by Richard and escorted by Mary and Edward in the back of the police cruiser. The initial prognosis was grim: severe dehydration, muscle atrophy, and shock, but miraculously, no life-threatening internal injuries. Dr. Sally, the lead vet, marveled at the dog's tenacity. "It's a miracle," she told Mary, noting the incredible strength required for such a large dog to survive days essentially standing, cemented in place. She nicknamed him Ghost for his pale appearance and near-invisible survival. During her examination, Dr. Sally found something peculiar: a small, perfectly round, hairless scar just behind Ghost's left ear. It was almost impossible to spot, feeling more like a tiny, healed puncture wound than an injury. She made a note to run a specialized scan once the dog was stable. The story of the rescue exploded immediately. Richard, now publicly hailed as a hero, carefully framed the narrative, ensuring the emphasis remained on the cruelty of the act and the bravery of Edward. Within hours, Edward's image, kneeling beside the freed, suffering dog, was viral, triggering a massive public outpouring of support. But the most incredible transformation was the bond itself. Edward, the silent and internal boy, insisted on visiting Ghost daily, often bringing his father, Benjamin, along. The staff tried to keep distance for the traumatized animal, but Ghost, despite his past as a highly trained protection dog, showed no aggression. In fact, he only seemed to relax when Edward was near. When the boy placed his hand on Ghost's head, the dog would sink his chin onto the blankets, closing his eyes in a deep, peaceful calm Mary had never seen in him before. During one of these quiet visits, as Dr. Sally monitored Ghost, she watched Edward talking softly to the dog. He wasn't speaking to her or his mother, but to Ghost, his voice a steady, low murmur. He gently rubbed the strange scar behind Ghost's ear and whispered something that froze Dr. Sally where she stood. Edward was saying, with a chilling knowledge, "The bad people tried to take your good thoughts. They used the silence protocol." Dr. Sally, realizing the child had just referenced a highly technical term for neural manipulation, knew the scar was more than just a scar. This dog was not a victim of random cruelty, he was the escapee of something highly sophisticated and terrifying. The secret is out: Edward knows about the silence protocol. Do you think this bond is just empathy, or is there something supernatural at play? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe as this helps our channel grow. Dr. Sally's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Edward whisper to Ghost. The boy, usually so quiet he was almost a phantom himself, was suddenly speaking with a vocabulary and intensity that defied his 4 years. They tried to use the silence protocol. They wiped the good memories. The specific, clinical nature of the phrase, coupled with the boy's unnerving composure, sent a shiver down the vet's spine. This was no innocent babbling, this was information. She waited until Mary and Edward left, the boy giving Ghost a final, silent, meaningful look. Once the door was closed, Dr. Sally immediately initiated a deep cranial scan on the German Shepherd. She focused the imaging technology squarely on the small, hairless scar she had noticed behind Ghost's ear, an area too precise for a simple, accidental injury. The result flashed on the screen, confirming her worst fears and lending chilling credence to Edward's statement. Tucked just beneath the surface layer of skin and skull, a few millimeters from the dog's auditory nerve, was a tiny, non-metallic chip, a sophisticated neural implant. It was designed to be virtually undetectable without specialized equipment. Dr. Sally immediately called Richard, the rescue technician she now knew was actually a deep-cover operative. When she described the device and repeated the phrase, "the silence protocol," that Edward had used, Richard's voice on the other end of the line went cold. "I know that name, Dr. Sally," he said grimly. It's the code word for a black market operation we've been tracking for months. They traffic in high-value, highly trained protection dogs. They use these neural implants to suppress all aggression, loyalty, and previous memory. They reset the dog before selling them to the highest bidder, usually dangerous criminals who want a perfectly blank, silent weapon. The horrific reality crashed down on Dr. Sally. Ghost hadn't been cemented in the wall by a random sadist. He was a piece of high-value property that had either resisted or escaped the memory wipe and was sealed away, not for punishment, but to destroy the evidence and silence the protocol failure permanently. The wall was his grave, ordered by a sophisticated criminal enterprise. And the only reason they knew the truth was because a 4-year-old boy possessed a connection so deep, he could read the unspeakable fear and trauma locked inside the dog's electronic prison. The truth is out. Ghost is not just a dog, but the key to dismantling a cruel, black market operation. This story is just beginning to unfold. If you're on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this video with everyone you know. Tell us, where are you watching from as this chilling conspiracy is exposed? The digital imaging on Dr. Sally's monitor didn't just reveal a foreign object, it exposed a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The non-metallic neural inhibitor chip was a web of microscopic filaments designed to fuse with Ghost's nervous system, a piece of technology so advanced it could only belong to a ghost organization. When the local police, spurred by Richard's urgent intel, ran the serial signature through an international database, the results sent shockwaves through the department. This was the smoking gun for the silence protocol. The clandestine firm behind the operation specialized in high-stakes erasure. They targeted elite, highly trained security dogs, animals that knew too much or had served in sensitive roles, and subjected them to a digital death. By wiping their memories and suppressing their natural instincts, the firm could reprogram these animals into blank slate protectors for criminal syndicates and warlords. It was a billion-dollar black market of stolen souls. However, Ghost was different. His spirit had been too fierce, his loyalty too deeply ingrained to be deleted by a machine. He had resisted the final memory wipe, his brain firing back against the inhibitor chip with such force that he became a protocol failure. The investigators realized with horror that Ghost hadn't been abandoned, he had been executed. The firm couldn't risk a sentient witness of their failed experiment wandering the streets. To the people behind the silence protocol, Ghost was a corrupted hard drive that needed to be destroyed and buried where no one would ever look. Sealing him inside the concrete wall of a building slated for demolition was their way of ensuring the evidence would be crushed into dust by a wrecking ball within 48 hours. As the details of the firm's operation surfaced, the world watched in stunned silence. This wasn't just a story about a dog in a wall. It was a revelation of a global conspiracy that treated life as disposable data. And at the center of it all was a 4-year-old boy whose quiet empathy had managed to bypass the most sophisticated encryption on the planet. We are reaching the heart of this mystery, and the world is finally listening. If you believe that every living being deserves to have their story heard, please subscribe and join our community. In the sterile, fluorescent glow of the hospital waiting room, the man known as Richard finally set aside the heavy tools of a technician. As Mary watched him peel back the layers of his standard-issue uniform, he revealed a badge and a level of authority that no municipal worker could possess. He wasn't just a man with a sledgehammer, he was a lead operative for an international task force dedicated to dismantling high-level animal trafficking syndicates. For months, he had been chasing shadows, following the whispers of a ghost program that erased the identities of elite service animals, but the trail had always gone cold at the edge of the law, until Edward found the wall. Richard sat across from Mary and Benjamin, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and grim relief. He explained that the industrial site hadn't been a random stop for him. He had been surveilling the firm's activity in the area but lacked the probable cause to breach the structure. If it hadn't been for Edward's inexplicable insistence and those first desperate whimpers, the silence protocol would have remained a myth, and Ghost would have been nothing more than dust in a demolition pile. Richard's true purpose was to bridge the gap between a heartwarming rescue and a federal investigation. He had already secured the digital logs from the site and the physical evidence of the neural chip, transforming a local miracle into a global investigative exposé. His involvement acted as the catalyst that the authorities couldn't ignore. With a deep cover agent's testimony and the forensic evidence from Ghost's body, that a silence protocol was no longer a conspiracy theory, it was a crime scene. As Richard spoke, the news monitors in the background began to flash his name and the horrific details of the clandestine firm. The heartwarming story of a boy and his dog was rapidly evolving into a massive movement for justice, a wave of outrage that was reaching every corner of the globe. Richard looked at Edward, who was leaning his head against Mary's shoulder, and realized that while he had the badge, the little boy was the one who had truly broken the case. The walls are finally coming down, not just for Ghost, but for the monsters who tried to hide him. Do you think there are more dogs like Ghost waiting to be found? Share your thoughts below and let us know where you are watching from as we prepare for the final showdown. Don't forget to subscribe, you won't want to miss how Edward finally speaks for those who can't. The morning of the national press conference felt like the world had collective bated breath, but inside the crowded hearing room, the air was perfectly still. Mary sat in the front row, her hands trembling, while Edward sat on a high chair at the witness table. Beside him, Ghost stood tall, no longer the emaciated creature from the wall, but a majestic, silver-antan guardian. The cameras of every major news network were trained on the 4-year-old boy who had become the unlikely face of a revolution. When the lead investigator asked for a statement, Edward didn't look at the microphones or the flashing lights. He simply placed his hand on the back of Ghost's neck, right over the spot where the neural chip had once been. In a voice that was clear, steady, and filled with a wisdom far beyond his years, Edward began to speak. He didn't tell a story from a child's perspective, he relayed a data stream of memories that had been trapped in the silence protocol. He named names, cited locations of hidden laboratories, and detailed the final moments before Ghost was entombed. The room fell into a shocked silence as the boy articulated the exact coordinates of the firm's headquarters, information that only a being who had been inside the network could know. It was as if Ghost was using Edward's voice to finally scream the truth that had been suppressed by wires and concrete. The fallout was instantaneous. Within hours, the clandestine firm was raided, its leaders arrested, and the silence protocol was dismantled forever. But for Mary, the true miracle wasn't the justice being served on the news, it was the boy standing before her. The Edward who had once retreated into a shell of silence was gone. In his place was a child who stood with his shoulders back, speaking with a newfound confidence that radiated from his soul. He had found his voice by giving one to a creature the world had tried to erase. As the hearing concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Edward leaned down and whispered into Ghost's ear. He then looked up at the sea of reporters and his mother, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He delivered his final statement, a message channeled directly from the spirit of the dog who had refused to die. He says we found our voice, together. Now, we use it. Mary realized then that their bond hadn't just saved a life, it had healed a heart and changed the world. Justice has finally been served, but the journey of Edward and Ghost is just beginning. If this story moved you to tears and reminded you of the power of a child's love, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. We want to keep sharing these incredible journeys with you. Tell us in the comments.